Imagine a formation that had dominated battlefields for generations, a serried wall of spears that crushed foes on open ground, collapsing in roughly 60 minutes. What Rome did to destroy Macedonia in just 1 hour was not a miracle. It was planning, patience, and a cold exploitation of a single structural weakness: terrain. On Topetisesenka June 168 BCE, near Pydna in northern Greece, those factors combined and turned a Macedonian advantage into a catastrophic defeat. The story begins with legacy. Alexander the Great had reshaped the eastern Mediterranean, and his successors kept alive a battlefield innovation that became synonymous with Macedonian power: the phalanx. Picture it as a dense block of heavily armored infantry, ranks upon ranks, each man holding a sarissa, a long pike, often reported to reach up to 6 meters. When deployed on flat, open ground, this formation presented a forest of points impossible for most enemies to cross. Its strength lay in cohesion and reach, but cohesion becomes a liability when terrain interrupts discipline. Across the Italian peninsula, Rome was growing into a republic of hardened soldiers and adaptable tactics. A Roman legion was organized on principles opposite to the phalanx: smaller tactical units, greater flexibility, and training designed for close combat. Where the sarissa favored reach, Roman short swords and pila favored maneuver and stabbing once the enemy closed. Decades of campaigning had taught Roman commanders how to turn rigidity into a target. Perseus, king of Macedon, trusted that the phalanx could decide the day. Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the Roman consul and general, understood that facing those long pikes head-on on their ideal ground would be a gamble. Instead of forcing a frontal collision on a straight plane, Paulus maneuvered for months, probing, withdrawing, and baiting. He avoided giving Perseus the clear field he craved. The tone of the campaign was patient. Paulus was content to wait for an opening rather than create one by direct assault. If you enjoy deep dives into ancient battles and military thinking, hit like and subscribe. There's more to unpack about how empires die and are born on fields like Pydna. The armies finally met at a place that was imperfect for both sides. Sources estimate that Perseus could muster roughly 44,000 men, while Paulus commanded around 38,000. Figures reported by ancient writers and treated by modern historians with cautious acceptance. The ground near Pydna was not a flat plain. It was a patchwork: gentle rises, broken gullies, and pockets of uneven earth interspersed with stretches of open turf. That mixed terrain was the critical variable. The battle itself began almost by mistake. Accounts suggest an incidental skirmish or a panicked horse triggered the clash. A small incident that ignited the tinder. The phalanx moved forward. At first, its effect was devastating. The Macedonian front, with its bristling sarissas, crashed into the Roman lines and pushed them back. For a time, the superiority of reach seemed to tell the whole story. Long spears kept Roman soldiers at bay, and the massed weight of the formation rolled like a living battering ram. But then the ground betrayed the phalanx. Where the soil tilted, where a rank stumbled over uneven footing, the sarissas could no longer form a continuous hedge. The immense pikes, so useful in a steady, level advance, became awkward and cumbersome when men were no longer perfectly aligned. Units that had to change step opened tiny gaps. Those gaps multiplied. Ranks lost touch with the men beside them. The very discipline that powered the phalanx became the mechanism of its undoing. Paulus did not need a glorious charge to win. He had trained his men to exploit the moment. As the Macedonian ranks shuddered and small pockets of space appeared, Roman maniples, the legion's modular tactical units, stopped yielding ground and countered. Short, armored soldiers slipped between the points of the sarissas. Once inside the phalanx's outer layer, legionaries could use the gladius, the short sword designed for stabbing, where the long pike could not be effectively wielded. The Romans fought in close quarters, while the sarissas tripped and tangled. Macedonian soldiers found themselves jammed, unable to present their pikes coherently or to pivot the long spears in cramped conditions. That moment, the conversion of a disciplined push into disorganized clusters, was decisive. What had been a rolling wall turned into chaotic pockets of resistance. Soldiers tripped over protruding sarissas. Commanders lost the ability to coordinate. The Romans, trained to exploit small openings and to fight in tight formations, did what they had been drilled to do: push into those breaches and remove the phalanx's advantage. Casualties escalated quickly. Ancient sources report around 20,000 Macedonians killed and approximately 11,000 taken prisoner. Roman losses are described as comparatively light. These numbers come from period accounts that vary in detail. Historians treat them as indicative rather than exact. The striking thing is not the precise tally, but the speed and scale of the collapse. In roughly an hour, a formation that had dominated for generations ceased to function as a cohesive fighting force. Tactically, the lesson is stark and straightforward. The sarissa demanded space and rhythm. The phalanx required a steady pace and flat ground to maintain alignment. The legion required adaptability and short-range dominance. When space narrowed and footing became uncertain, the phalanx's physics turned against it. Paulus's decision to avoid forcing a fight on the enemy's terms and instead to include waiting for a fractured moment was not dramatic in itself. No trumpet charge, no daring flanking maneuver written for posters, but it was ruthlessly effective. Rome's victory at Pydna was the product of patience, discipline, and an ability to exploit a single battlefield variable. The immediate consequences were profound. Perseus was captured and paraded before Roman audiences as proof of Rome's triumph. The Roman Senate did not simply leave Macedon leaderless. It chose to dismantle the political and military structures that had supported the Antigonid dynasty. Macedon was divided administratively into 4 separate client republics. The monarchy was effectively abolished, and the economic instruments that underpinned elite power, including control over mines and certain revenues, were curtailed. These measures aimed at preventing a rapid reconstitution of Macedonian power, but they also sowed instability. Fragmented governance, economic dislocation, and social stress became the new reality for the former kingdom. Instability invites ambition. About 18 years after Pydna, a pretender named Andriscus claimed to be a scion of the old royal line and managed briefly to rally Macedonian resistance and to take back territory. His revolt alarmed Rome. The Republic sent Quintus Caecilius Metellus to restore order. Metellus defeated Andriscus and enforced a more permanent solution: the formal provincialization of Macedon. With that administrative step, the Antigonid dynasty's political authority ended, and Rome's control over Greece and the surrounding regions tightened. The Eastern Mediterranean's balance of power shifted decisively. Rome was no longer simply a rising republic. It had become the arbiter in the former Hellenistic world. The meaning of Pydna goes beyond numbers and decrees. It is a cautionary example about military systems and the conditions they require. A weapon or formation that delivers dominance in one environment can become a liability in another. Discipline, training, and historical prestige can blind rulers to vulnerability. Perseus trusted the phalanx because it had won wars under Alexander's heirs. Paulus distrusted it because he knew, in his bones and in his tactical education, that formations break when the ground betrays them. 1 hour of concentrated battlefield failure erased not only a field army, but a dynasty's practical power. It is worth stressing that ancient accounts do not always agree on every detail of the clash. Some chronologies differ on the spark that started the fighting. Casualty figures vary across sources. Modern historians debate the precise mechanics of the engagement and the character of the terrain. Yet the broad outline is consistent. A phalanx that relied on uninterrupted cohesion encountered mixed ground, lost that cohesion, and Rome's adaptable infantry capitalized on the disintegration. The result was swift, devastating, and geopolitically transformative. The way that Roman commanders translated a tactical victory into political restructuring also deserves attention. Rome's response to victory at Pydna was not merely punitive, it was preventive. By breaking Macedon into smaller units, by curbing elite economic control, and by installing arrangements that favored Roman interests, the Senate sought to ensure that the same military threat could not re-emerge. Those measures were effective in the immediate sense. They removed the Antigonid crown and limited Macedonian autonomy, but they also carried long-term consequences. The fragmentation and economic disruption contributed to resentment and instability that, decades later, would permit figures like Andriscus to try their luck. The transition from client kingdoms and divided republics to outright provincial rule was not immediate, but Pydna set that transition in irreversible motion. There is a broader lesson in the way an hour of combat can translate into generations of political change. Battles are not isolated events. They are strategic decisions writ in flesh and iron. Paulus's refusal to be baited into a straightforward confrontation, his willingness to let conditions favor him. These were choices with consequences far beyond the field. The Macedonian phalanx was not defeated because it was inherently inferior in all conditions. It was defeated because its success depended on circumstances that Rome was prepared to deny. In other words, adaptability trumped legacy. For those who study the ancient world, Pydna marks the moment when Rome's military doctrine and political calculation combined to unmake one of the old Hellenistic powers. The phalanx, once Alexander's cutting edge, remained formidable where flat fields allowed it to function. But the age in which a single formation could guarantee rule across varied landscapes was passing. Rome's model, elastic, administratively assertive and strategically patient, proved better suited to the patchwork of territories it sought to control. What Rome did to destroy Macedonia in just 1 hour was therefore not an act of random brutality, but a demonstration of how battlefield engineering, discipline, and strategic patience can cascade into empire. The field burned swiftly. The policy that followed burned longer. Perseus was removed, Macedonian sovereignty was fractured, and Rome tightened its grip on the eastern Mediterranean. The hour at Pydna reshaped the map and set a precedent for how Rome would consolidate power in conquered lands. If this kind of tactical and political breakdown intrigues you, there are more episodes to explore, from the evolution of the legion to the later campaigns that turned client kingdoms into provinces. Watch the next video on Roman military organization and see how the lessons of Pydna echoed through centuries of warfare.